Hi everybody, I'm Aaron Hernandez, and this is another episode of What's in the Deck Box. With me again today is Pauper Aficionado.
You did
Matt
it.
Bales. But we're talking Pauper Affinity today.
More robots.
More robots.
But actually Affinity this time.
Yep, we were talking about getting to play Frogmite the other day, so let's talk about some Frogmites.
Absolutely.
So Matt, let's start with the Affinity cards. Which
ones? There's so many.
Let's start with the threats.
Okay, Affinity threats. So up here, the top of the list, you've got the cheap ones, the Frogmites. That's a 4-mana converted mana cost card that effectively costs usually 0.
It's a card that his primary purpose is to come in packs and kind of power you up. The first Frogmite, not great. The fourth Frogmite for 0 mana, pretty out of control.
Yeah, I mean, usually it's like the second or third Frogmite brings you into a Myr Enforcer, and then things are just rolling at that point.
Which is basically giant Frogmite.
Yeah, it's bigger Frogmite. It costs 7. Sort of. And it's a 4/4, so it's double the power and toughness.
How many times are you actually paying mana for Myr Enforcer? Is it usually free? Is it usually 2 mana?
You're typically going to pay 2 to 3 mana for your Myr Enforcers. You are getting a lot of other advantages because all of your lands are basically dual land. Or,
Carouse, bounce lands, tap
some
for 2.
They tap for 2.
They're ancient tombs. We'll call them ancient tombs.
That's the one I was looking for.
There you go.
Unfortunately, with Pauper, you don't get ancient tomb, but having access to the artifact lands makes it effective enough.
And then our other cards with Affinity are
sure. So you got your Thoughtcasts, which is just generating more card advantage. You know, once you've put out enough of your Frogmites and you just so happen to have Seed of the Synod out in play or one of your filters, you just cast a 1-mana draw 2, and then keep going. So this is what's going to enable you to get to your 3rd and 4th Frogmite.
Okay, and it is just so efficient that it has to go in the deck a lot of the time.
Exactly. We've got a newcomer to the list
with
the Affinity stuff with Gearseeker Serpent.
The Affinity card that doesn't have the word Affinity on it.
Correct, but effectively, if we were going to errata this type line in the top of the text box, it says Affinity.
Well, this is actually something that Wizards has been really big on recently, is putting like one card in a set that draws reference to an old...
Right. They did that in Battle for Zendikar. There was a card that had Annihilator without saying Annihilator.
Yep. And shortly after that, they printed Gearseeker Serpent with Affinity.
One more spicy Affinity card?
I was going to say, this is the one that I did not think of going into this.
So this is definitely a spicy add-in. You don't see this in as many traditional Affinity lists in Pauper, but you've got Tooth of Chiss-Goria. There's also Scale of Chiss-Goria if you really want to get clever. It's basically the same card, but Tooth is an Affinity card. You can play it as though it had Flash.
Yeah.
I think it's errata to have Flash. I don't remember exactly, but effectively, you can play this as instant speed. It has Affinity, so usually you're paying nothing for it. You tap, you give a creature 1 more boost in power, and then if you have the card's namesake threat, you're just going to make that creature +3, basically.
Okay. And the fact that it also powers up your Affinity mid-turn, so you can untap with that extra artifact and play like a Frogmite or a Myr Enforcer because you got that free artifact.
Exactly, or like just threaten some sort of Affinity play at the end step and just kind of do...
Well, I imagine it's not something they are thinking to play around.
Very rarely.
So then we have a bunch of other cantrips to power up our artifacts.
Yeah, so I actually have kind of a full gamut of the cantrips. So up at the top, you've got your Chromatic Stars, which this is your namesake cantrip. It's the most efficient cantrip card in the Pauper list, but it's also not necessarily a budget consideration. Pauper's generally a cheap format. These are running between $6 and $8 at this point,
which is a lot for a Pauper card.
Yeah.
As you can see, we have lots of other options.
We have plenty of other options. The Prophetic Prisms to jump down and skip over some cards is typically a namesake to have 3 to 4 of. Has that enter the battlefield draw card effect. Up here are your budget considerations. So Terrarion has the same card draw ability that Chromatic Star does.
Okay.
So it does come into play tapped, so you don't get to use it for the mana filtration the first time you cast it, but if you're sacrificing it right away, it's still going to draw you that card even if you're not using its mana ability. Chromatic Sphere does a similar thing, but you have to activate it to get the card draw off of it. So we haven't talked about Atog yet, but you can sack Chromatic Stars and Terrarions to Atog, power up Atog, and draw a card off of it. Chromatic Sphere, you can't sack the Atog and also draw a card.
Okay, so you have to use the ability.
Right, so it has that little disadvantage. The Prophetic Prisms and the Alchemist Vials, which again, another new from a core set from Origins.
Yeah.
gives you the instant, as soon as you cast it, gives you card draw. And then you're going to get a similar effect off of the Ichor Wellspring. Ichor Wellspring is included because it gives you that enter the battlefield draw and the death trigger draw.
Yeah.
So you're going to draw a lot of cards.
Well, and this is one of the underrated things about Affinity in Pauper specifically, is you draw a ton of cards. Kind of in a similar way to the way Tron does in Modern, where you're just cycling these little cantrips that don't seem like they do much. But you functionally have a lot of mana in this deck because all your spells are very cheap with Affinity.
Right, everything's at a discount.
Kind of in the same way, kind of in the same way that Tron will cycle through a bunch of things because they just have a gajillion mana.
Right.
So you mentioned it earlier, and Anthony would be devastated if we didn't spend a little more time talking about Atog.
Yep.
This is our primary kill, right? This is the primary game plan?
Yeah, these are the beasties. I don't know if this is the artwork that Anthony would prefer we use, but it's definitely still got all of the flavor, some lovely teeth on this purple little monster. And this thing, it just makes the deck hum.
Yeah.
It is a threat. As soon as this is on the board, your opponent always has to be aware of Atog, aware of how many artifacts you have, and how many cards are in your hand, because this thing can easily be lethal on any given attack.
Well, and then the thing about it is because you cannot just Doomblade it necessarily.
Right.
You have to be afraid of the Fling.
Right. So, you make it huge, you're in combat, you're going to deal some damage, they try and kill it, and then it just goes to their face.
Yep.
So Fling is your ability to just kind of up and dodge whatever they're removing. Now Fling has its downsides. It is as an additional cost to cast Fling, you sack the creature.
So if it is countered, it is real bad for you.
So, against the Delver lists, if they go to Vapor Snag your Atog and you go to Fling it and then they get you with foil, that feels bad.
Yeah, for sure.
So in that sense, as fun as Pauper Affinity is, it is very much a glass cannon deck, more so
Makes
than
sense.
other Affinity lists. Like if you look into Legacy or Modern, even those decks have more resilience.
Those decks are more afraid of hate, whereas this deck is you can interact with it a little more fairly with just your counter spells and removal spells,
and just playing big creatures. Now the hate in Pauper is really strong.
That's true.
You really have to worry about Gorilla Shaman in subsequent games 2 and 3. Those do a lot of work against Affinity.
Yep, I mean even in lands.
Yeah, and it's brutal for 1 mana to just destroy a land. At the same time, if you can power out that quick early turn, so what, they're hitting your lands. They have to spend a lot of mana to kill Myr Enforcers. They have to spend a lot of mana to kill Frogmites with their...
Which don't cost you mana.
Right, exactly. So that gives you this kind of interplay. It makes this deck arbitrarily resilient against its hate.
Well, and along with Fling, we also have additional reach in our Galvanic Blasts, so we can just have that extra reach there at the end when we're getting them down to 4-8 life. Yeah. Just bam, bam.
Good old Pauper Big Bolt, and you can draw multiples off him with your Thoughtcast and all of your cantripping effects.
Yeah, to find enough to finish him out. Flayer Husk is an interesting one.
Yeah, the obligatory germ over here. Flayer Husk is a nice little feature. It gives you an early creature, an early threat that's also an artifact. And if you don't have the Atog yet, you can always just throw Flayer Husk onto a Frogmite and make it bigger.
Oh, makes sense.
So,
and then we talked a little bit about the artifact lands. We're playing basically all the ones that we can. We're missing all but 2.
Yeah, and really, you run the whole gamut of artifact lands, but really these are the kind of key colors that you're going after. These are just to run more artifact lands. It's really what it comes down to.
You play Darksteel Citadel in Modern.
Exactly.
Not your Modern.
Not anymore.
But
that's not the prevailing wisdom.
But colorless artifact lands are absolutely worth playing, and we have so many colorless spells that we don't really care. Plus, it does allow us a little flexibility in the sideboard. Let's get to that, shall we?
Yeah. So down here we got the sideboards. Now my sideboard's a little slapdash for just kind of in a very wide open anything that you could see local metagame.
Okay.
There's a lot to be said for fighting against Blue-Black Delver. You just got to try and be necessarily faster in general. But as we get down here, you've got Ray of Revelation. Bogle's just put a person into the Mythic Championship. So here you go for a good way to get rid of some of those enchantments that are on your slippery boys.
Well, and speaking of, it activates for green mana, right?
So this is one of those cards that has some activations for these off mana colors. But again, to point out, all of this stuff, short of the teeth, can make different mana. So even if you don't have
all 5, we really can play all 5 colors in the sideboard.
It's again another prismatic deck. And you have another Gearseeker Serpent for just some other aggression that isn't an artifact.
Okay, so when they're bringing in artifact hate, you want non-artifact threats. Makes sense.
Right.
Disciple of the Vault, just helping out with the Atog kill, giving you a way to reach, or what's the...
So that, and also just in general, this gives you, again, effect against the sideboard hate that's going to be destroying artifacts.
Because they blow up your artifacts, it's just the same as you sacking them to Atog.
So Disciple is this other kill condition. If you have Atog out, Disciple just makes everything you do that much more threatening.
Mm-hmm. And then it just makes all their removal spells that little bit worse. Makes sense.
Any of these activations that require a sacrifice, it's going to trigger Disciple.
Makes sense. Ancient Grudge, primarily for the Myr, one of my favorite sideboard cards. It slices, it dices, it blows up 2 artifacts.
Yeah. Arguably, these could easily become Gorilla Shamans, and some of the affinity lists you'll see running around that are trying to spike or go really deep on it will make those Gorilla Shamans. But I like the Ancient Grudge tech because, well, you can't Galvanic Blast an Ancient Grudge.
It's true.
Then we get into fighting against the graveyard decks. You got Nihil Spellbombs. It's fun to sack one of these to an Atog, pay a black, and draw a card.
It's pretty good. Pretty good.
And when in doubt, it's there to make sure that their Gurmag Anglers don't come out as fast as they hope. And in general, it's just like a cheap artifact. Again, there's a lot of options here. These could easily become Relic of Progenitus. Mm-hmm. They can easily become Tormod's Crypts. Can they become Tormod's Crypts? I can't remember if that was common or not.
I think it is.
It probably is. I know the time-shifted one technically is rare, but hey, that's time-shifted weirdness. You get over here, if you need some more removal, Executioner's Capsule is a fun little spell to throw in there.
Serrated Arrows and Electrickery as well, depending on what you're trying to kill.
Yeah, so the Electrickeries are specifically going to be, hey, you see those little green men running around? If you need to kill elves, Electrickery is the best way to do so. Against Delver lists, Executioner's Capsule is a fun way to get it underneath their counter and their permissions.
Makes sense.
So
just get it on the board, or at least. So that
if they're throwing an early foil out to counter your Executioner's Capsule, you're going to
win it. You're going to win on cards.
You're going to do pretty good. Yeah. Just hoping they don't have too many gushes.
Gosh.
And then Serrated Arrows is another one of those cards. It's going to be recursive removal. It's going to take down a bunch of creatures, make some big Gurmag Anglers smaller so you can power through them with a Myr Enforcer.
Awesome, man. Looks like a lot of fun.
It's a blast.
And that's Matt's Pauper Affinity list with actual affinity cards.
And artifact lands.
Yeah, so if you're looking for a deck, so Fling a giant Atog at someone, this is your deck. Until next time, I'm Aaron Hernandez, and this has been What's in the Deck Box.